When the Seraphic Father, Saint Francis, learned by divine inspiration that God had called him and his brethren not only for their own sanctification, but also for the welfare and salvation of all men, that they were therefore to go not only to the nations of Christendom, but also to the infidel and the heathen, he joyfully exclaimed, "Let us go in the name of the Lord," and at once set out to preach penance to the people of Aemilia, the marches of Ancona, and Umbria. Later, when the number of his brethren had increased, he sent them to Greece, Spain, France, Germany, and England. In 1219, he himself with 12 companions set out to preach the gospel to the Saracens of Syria and Egypt, while he commissioned 6 of his brethren to preach to the infidels of Morocco. The brethren destined for this difficult field of labor were the priests Vitalis, who was also appointed superior of the little band, Berard, Peter, and Otto, and the lay brothers Accursius, and Ajudas. Calling them to his presence, Saint Francis, with words breathing love and solicitude for their temporal and eternal welfare, instructed and encouraged them, and finally dismissed them with his blessing, "May the blessing of God the Father descend upon you, as it did of old upon the apostles. He who sends you, will himself watch over you. To his holy keeping I commit you, he will endow you with strength from above, he will put his words on your lips and teach you what you are to say. Fear not, for God is with you. Go, then, in the name of the Lord who sends you." Consoled and strengthened by these words of the Seraphic Father, the 6 brethren at once set out for their field of labor. When they arrived in Aragon, Spain, Father Vitalis fell seriously ill, and was unable to proceed farther. Submitting to the will of God, he allowed his companions to continue their journey with Father Berard as their superior. After passing through Portugal, to whose queen they foretold their martyrdom and the translation of their bodies to Coimbra, Portugal, they proceeded to Seville, one of the most important cities in the possession of the Mohammedans in Spain. Here they spent 8 days in retirement, in the house of a rich merchant, begging God in humble prayer for light and strength to carry out a work undertaken solely for his honor and glory. Filled with the Spirit of God, and, like the apostles of old, entirely indifferent to danger, Berard and his companions at length left their retirement, and went straight to the principal mosque of the city to preach the gospel of Christ. Driven away with insults and blows by the infuriated Mohammedans, the holy missionaries went to the palace of the king, where they fearlessly proclaimed the truth of the Christian religion and the falsity of the teachings of Muhammad. The king was so exasperated by their fearless words, that he ordered them to be executed, and the sentence would have been carried out at once, if the king's son had not called attention to the resentment which the execution would cause among the Christian princes, and to the dissatisfaction and spirit of rebellion it would arouse in his own state. The king, thereupon, ordered the confessors of Christ to be imprisoned. When it became evident that all attempts to shake their constancy were in vain, they were placed on board a ship which brought them to Morocco, in Africa. On their arrival in Morocco, Berard and his companions were hospitably received by the Infante Don Pedro, who had taken refuge there on account of a disagreement with his brother, the King of Portugal. The holy missionaries, whose greatest desire was to gain souls for Christ and to suffer for his holy name, left the palace of Don Pedro the next day, and began to preach in the streets and squares of the city. King Miramelin, happening to pass by when Berard was preaching and inveighing against the teachings of Muhammad, became so enraged at his words that he commanded the holy preacher and his companions to be expelled from the country. They, however, succeeded in escaping from their guards, and returned to Morocco. When this was reported to the king, he commanded them to be cast into a dark and moist dungeon, where they remained for 20 days without food and drink, but at the end of this period they appeared healthier and stronger than before. In the meantime, the country was visited by a drought and other afflictions. The king, listening to the appeals of his people, who declared the afflictions to be marks of the divine vengeance, once more set the missionaries free, and ordered them to be sent to a Christian country. But they again eluded their guards, and returned to Morocco. After remaining for some time in the palace of Don Pedro, they accompanied him on a military expedition against some tribes that had rebelled against King Miramon. On this expedition, God glorified his servants by a miracle in behalf of the army. The troops, obliged to cross a desert, were soon reduced to the last extremity for lack of water. At the prayer of Berard, a clear spring of water gushed forth from the sand, and did not cease to flow until all had quenched their thirst. Returning from the expedition, the holy missionaries began to preach with even greater zeal than before. They were again seized and cast into prison, where they had to undergo the most cruel torments. They were bound hand and foot, dragged on the ground, and scourged until their bones and entrails were almost laid bare. They were next rolled over fragments of broken glass, while the executioners poured vinegar and boiling oil into their bleeding wounds. The confessors of Christ bore all this not only with patience, but even with joy, giving thanks to God that they were found worthy to suffer for his holy name. After spending the night in prayer, during which they received extraordinary heavenly consolations, Berard and his companions were brought before the king. He endeavored by threats and by promises of riches and sensual pleasures to shake their constancy, but they rejected his proposals with horror and indignation. "We seek only Jesus Christ," they exclaimed. "Thou canst invent all sorts of tortures, thou canst take away our lives, every pain seems light to us when we think of the glory of heaven." The courage and firmness of the holy confessors enraged the king, and drawing his scimitar, he split open their heads. Thus died the first martyrs of the Seraphic Order on January 16, 1220. Their mutilated bodies were dragged through the streets and exposed to many indignities, but were finally recovered by the Christians. Don Pedro had the remains encased in costly shrines, and brought them to Coimbra, in Portugal, where they were solemnly interred in the church of the monastery of the Holy Cross of the Canons Regular of St. Augustine. It was on this occasion that Ferdinand, a young religious of the monastery, who afterwards was known as Antony of Padua, inspired by the zeal and glorious death of the martyrs, determined to become a son of Saint Francis. Many miracles were wrought at the tomb of the martyrs, and they were canonized by Sixtus IV in 1481. How does not the holy example of the martyrs put to shame the weakness and cowardice of Christians who find it difficult to make sacrifices for the faith, to bear the yoke of the gospel, who for the sake of some temporal advantage are ready to make a compromise with the world and its principles, to the detriment of their immortal souls and to the scandal of others? Oh, how will such Christians one day regret their half-heartedness and cowardice! On the other hand, how richly will God reward the smallest sacrifice we make in his service! The sufferings of this time are riot worthy to be compared with the glory to come, that shall be revealed in us.